Washington Journal continues.
A focus now on the ongoing nationwide protests in Iran, potential U.S. response. We're joined again by Behnam Ben Taleblu. He serves as Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Behnam Ben Taleblu, it was back on January 4th that you had a column in the Free Press in which you said there's something different about these protests. These protests have only grown and the government response has grown since you wrote that piece. Take us back to the origination of these protests. How did they start, and what is different about them?
Sure, absolutely, and great to be with you, and belated Happy New Year to you and your viewers. As long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there's been protests against an Islamic Republic. That is not new for you or the viewers. But this protest was triggered on December 28th when the rial, which is the Iranian currency, reached a historic high, significant inflation, hyperinflation in that country. The rial was valued then at 1.43 million to a single US dollar. So people's savings, people's earnings, people's ability to actually generate income from even having a menu on a restaurant all basically evaporated. And protests began in the Tehran Bazaar. Tehran actually has the biggest bazaar in the modern Middle East. Has played a historic role in previous protest movements, including the 1979 revolution. But then within a day, it developed a contagion effect across society. And then within 2 days across Iran entirely, such that by the time you got into a week of protests had touched all of Iran's 31 different provinces. And then they began to spiral. And as you know, just like we've talked about in the past, what starts as an economic protest, what starts as an environmental protest, what starts as a social protest, quickly morphs into a political protest, because this has been the trend of anti-regime protests since December 2017. People have mass grievances, people have pushed past reform, people are looking to use every opportunity to push past the state and actually talk about the one thing that Washington very often for the past decade and a half is very keen to avoid in the Middle East, which is fundamentally regime change. And what was triggered by an economic crisis became basically the latest installation of a movie we've been seeing for 8-9 years in Iran, which is Iran's national uprising.
So is there an opportunity for regime change? How likely is that to happen? And what would be the U.S. role in that?
Well, much does ride on the U.S. role. We're having this conversation today where President Trump will be convening senior national security officials, including defense officials, trying to tailor a U.S. response. We can get to the potential red line that he drew a bit later in the conversation. But make no mistake, this is very, very different from, neighboring Iraq or neighboring Afghanistan or even the past 2-3 decades of the U.S. experience in the Middle East. This is not about something being imposed from abroad. This is if the world can support something that has been happening organically from within. So we know that, you and the viewers may know 1999, 2009, the Green Movement, again, major anti-regime protests. But again, I want to stress, since 2017, since 2018, Iranians have been protesting en masse, not to change the exchange rate, but to change the regime in its entirety. And when you have fundamentally a more progressive, a more secular, a more nationalist, a more young, a more liberal population that is unarmed, that keeps going up against a much more regressive, a much more authoritarian, a much more Islamist and autocratic dictatorship that is armed to the teeth, and as we've seen in the past few days, willing to throttle and then later shut off the internet so under the cover of darkness they can kill. I just saw a horrifying report from a major Iranian diaspora news outlet that confirmed up to 12,000 killed under the cover of the internet blackout over the past 4 days. Really horrific. This is the most significant protest crackdown in the history of the Islamic Republic. Of course, the people are going to lose their best and their brightest in every single iteration of protest. So much will ride on if regime change is possible. Can Washington help put the squeeze on the regime from the top so that the people can continue to put the squeeze on the regime from below?
What is the news outlet that you talk about? I ask because people are trying to get an understanding of what's actually going on. There's a picture on the front page of the New York Times. This image on the front page, verified by the New York Times, showing the apparent body bags in Iran. This is out of Tehran, but people are trying to figure out what's going on. There's been reports over the weekend that it was hundreds, you could say 12,000. Just what sources do you trust?
So about 500-600 have been confirmed by independent human rights monitors. Then there are reporters, in particular this outlet that I mentioned was called Iran International. They actually have an English webpage as well. They're headquartered in London and headquartered in the U.S. as well. They basically have talked to a whole host of reporters, people who have actually been providing some of these images, more importantly, medical staff, nurses, doctors, morgues in Iran, sources within the government, sources within city councils that basically have been dealing with this issue. And I think the most horrific thing that I've seen is actually reading something in print. I've seen a lot of those images over the weekend, but the most horrific thing I've seen is a text saying someone just woke up one morning, went for a stroll in the street to see if there were protests that AM, and instead saw just, city cleaners, government employees, laborers, power washing blood off of the streets after the crackdown from the night before. So there is so much imagery, but there is so much still that has yet to come out. And again, if folks want to check out that report that just a few hours ago said up to 12,000 killed, which would be the most significant crackdown from the state against the street in the history of the 46, 47-year Islamic Republic, that is at Iran International.
You mentioned Donald Trump's red line. Remind us what that is, what he said here.
So one reason why these protests are different is because Trump is actually choosing to make them different, or choosing to really touch the issue. If you will, these protests didn't come out of a vacuum. They are 6 months after the 12-day war, which was when the U.S. and Israel struck Iran's nuclear program. Many so-called experts then said that there would be a rally around the flag effect. There was not only no rally, Iranians in these protests have been taking down and burning regime flags. So for many reasons...
And putting up a different flag.
Precisely. Putting up the pre-1979 flag. In terms of chants and slogans, we've seen since 2017 steadily, increasingly call for a more nationalist orientation in terms of what the protesters want, but also increasingly calling for the exiled crown prince and his family. So there's a significant difference. If you go Islamist, I go nationalist. They found the exact foil to the identity and the ideology to the regime. But back to Donald Trump. He, on Truth Social, very early this year, had said that if the regime cracks down, and he says, as is their custom, because Trump actually has the most popular tweet in the history of the Persian language on Twitter, from his first term when he stood with Iranian protesters, famously drawing a very sharp contrast with his Democratic predecessor, Barack Obama, when it came to the 2009 protests. And he said that there would be a U.S. response, and he used the word locked and loaded. So people assumed a potential military response. In the ensuing days, in his media clips, in his media statements aboard Air Force One to the press, and again on Truth Social, he reiterated that claim. And what was a historic standing with protesters early this January is now reaching a point of diminishing returns, because he's talked about potentially standing with protesters and holding the regime accountable, but at the same time, unfortunately, has kind of watered it down, saying that the reports of deaths he had received were due to a stampede rather than this massive regime crackdown. And only just 2 days ago, I believe, aboard Air Force One, he said that they appear to be crossing his red line. And that's why today's meeting with senior national security officials about how, if, when, and at all will they respond is going to be key to dictating the success of this movement, as well as what level of U.S. support will be provided, if any.
One of your colleagues at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, writing in today's Wall Street Journal alongside a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, urging the president to not repeat Obama's mistake when it comes to Iran. What they're referring to when they say Obama's mistake is a Syrian red line that Barack Obama had set, and then Syria crosses that line, and the lack of U.S. response. Is that your feeling here as well?
There's also talk of another comparison with the Obama administration, which is aboard Air Force One in the same interview where Donald Trump was talking to the press about, potentially enforcing that red line, and he said that the Iranians appear to be crossing it. He also mentioned for the first time that the Iranians had reached out to negotiate with him amidst all of this crackdown. And a comparison that actually comes to mind is not just Syria Obama 2013, but Iran Obama 2009, when there were protests on the street, where protesters were calling for Obama, are you with us or are you with them? And because the Obama administration was looking to draw a sharp contrast with the regime change legacy of the Bush administration and democracy promotion in the Middle East, the president kept as his prize trying to negotiate with the Islamic Republic and preferenced nuclear diplomacy, or the attempt to get nuclear diplomacy, over standing with protesters. And now the great fear here is not that President Trump will replicate a 2013 red line, but that he will actually live up to President Obama's 2009 mistake and actually try to negotiate with the Islamic Republic. Potentially, this could be a head bob. He could be faking out the Islamic Republic if indeed he does choose a military option. Potentially, he's leaking something to make the regime look weak as it's cracking down at home. But make no mistake, all of this flip-flopping actually removes that wind beneath the wing that he very importantly gave Iranian protesters with that moral support.
The protests in Iran, the latest there, our topic. Behnam Ben Taleblu, our guest, and a very good one on this topic. Remind viewers how long you've focused on Iran.
Sure. So I've had the luxury of looking at Iran for almost all my life, but with FDD now, I've been there just about 13 years in various capacities, and for a little over a year and a half as the senior director of their entire Iran program.
And he's here to answer your questions. 202-748-8000 for Democrats, Republicans, 202-748-8001, Independents, 202-748-8002. Plenty of callers for you already on this topic. Marty up first out of Louisville, Kentucky, Democrat. Marty, you're on with Behnam Ben Taleblu.
Good morning, John. I have a couple comments for the guests, and then I'll hang up. I was in college here in the United States in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution, and the Iranian students at our college explained to me that the Death to America demonstrations you're seeing every night on ABC are not pointed at the American people. It's the American government for keeping a brutal dictator in power in their country for 25 years. And I'm having trouble believing that any American involvement in forcing regime change in Iran can do anything other than being disastrous. I was just listening to Richard Engel talk on the Today Show, explaining that if the United States tries to overthrow the Iranian government, it's going to be a much bigger military operation than what we saw in Venezuela, which was just a commando raid that only lasted a few hours. And as far as the Iranian policy toward Israel, which is a policy of hatred, it's not. It seems to me that whatever regime is in charge in Iran, it's going to be the same because it's not a political group. Like in Iraq, Saddam Hussein represented a political party, the Ba'ath Party, which no longer exists. But the policy of hatred toward Israel is based in their religion, the Muslim religion, and it just seems to me that whatever group is in charge of their government in Iran is still going to be the same policy. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Marty, thanks for that. Behnam Ben Taleblu.
Sure, thanks, Marty. Let's start backwards with the religion and the Israel issue. So, no, I will also tell you, as a first-generation Iranian-American, but also a Muslim, that it is not built in that every Muslim has to actually hate Jews or the state of Israel. Certainly is not the case. You actually see now Israel trying to build ties with more and more Muslim-majority nations. There's always this flirtation now with Saudi Arabia. There was talk of Indonesia. There is the Abraham Accords phenomenon, and there's tons and tons and tons of interfaith initiatives at the civil society level, at the non-government level, that disprove the thesis that just because you're a Muslim, you have to hate Jews or Israel. So there's that fact. Second, tied to that is actually Iranian society. Iranian society is actually hyper-secular, whether you're looking at the names of families compared drastically to the names of families even pre-revolution, which actually had much more religious names, whether you're looking at levels of mosque attendance, whether you're looking at religiosity in public life. If you actually flip the script on the government of the Islamic Republic, you will actually have one of the most secular countries in the heartland of the Middle East. And you don't have to take that from me. You can just take a look at literally Arab tourists from the Muslim world who have gone to Iran, even at peak holy months like Ramadan, and have asked, is this even a Muslim nation? So ironically, there's a saying in Persian, you try to push someone into heaven, they pop out of the other side of hell. Ironically, after 46 years of an Islamist government, the last thing Iranian society wants is Islamism in any kind of form. So this fear that we've kind of seen with popular movements across the Arab world, where they're majority Islamist, has actually been the exact opposite with respect to Iran. And because the regime is Islamist, you have a pretty strong hyper-national, hyper-secular foil among society, and you see that against generation of Iranian protesters. So I don't believe that is necessarily the concern. In fact, you could flip the script and get something many Iranian dissidents and members of the diaspora have called the Cyrus Accords, which is to find a way to actually bridge the gap between these two ancient biblical non-Arab peoples, which are the Jews and the Persians. And to go back to your friends from college, I assume they're talking about 1953. One of the great things that is not talked about with respect to 1953 that did actually make, and yes, there was Western involvement, declassified documents from MI6, declassified documents from CIA, declassified documents from the State Department about this quote-unquote coup. But one of the things that actually helped make the coup historically successful was the flipping of Iran's clerical establishment from the pro-Mossadegh camp, from the prime minister at the time who was trying to nationalize the oil industry, to the Western bloc. So Iran's theocrats who are in power today are the heirs of people who made the flip to actually side with America and, per declassified documentation, got cash for it. And I'm not willing to give the leftists who made the Islamic Revolution in 1979 or the theocrats who are in charge today this kind of laissez-passer to ignore this gross historical fact that helped bring into power one of the most despotic regimes in the region, which, by the way, even if that human rights record was not the track record. As an American, as someone interested in American interests and American foreign policy, I think it's a pretty bad idea that for generations now we've been trying to pivot out of the Middle East and we keep getting sucked back in because of this strategic competition and the kind of terrorism emanating from the Islamic Republic. You don't have to take it from me. After the 12-day war between America, Iran, and Israel, Iran's clerical establishment issued a whole host of fatwas against the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump that called for the taking of his life, his property, his family, and even his wife and female children. So I simply don't think it's a good idea to let these governments, who traditionally have put their money where their mouth is, to be standing. So that's why, this is not about charity. To quote Henry Kissinger, foreign policy is not missionary work.
Way out to Hawaii. This is Alan, Independent Line. Alan, a very good early morning to you in Hawaii.
Hey, good morning, John and Ben. It's been a while. I actually called him once before and spoke to him, I think, on Iran and Rob Malley. I'm hoping, I'm really a big supporter that Donald Trump can do something brilliant and do something that will not cause inflammation, but will basically take down enough of the IRGC momentum to stop this mass killing and to help, if possible. And I'm just curious what Behnam thinks, what is the best path? I mean, because I actually started to watch the Free Press today, and you were on with Michael Duran, with great piece. I just got to see it a few minutes ago. I just heard that you were going to be on, so I stopped watching the Free Press and came to Washington Journal. But I was curious if maybe you could discuss what the FDD thinks is the best path. Is there a strategically perfect path to take to help the Iranian people to do a regime change?
Thanks, Alan. That's very kind of you, by the way. For years at FDD, we've been talking about something called maximum support. The defining elements of U.S. policy, particularly under Donald Trump since term one, has been maximum pressure, this kind of political and economic squeeze from the top that the U.S. government is able to kind of impose on the government of the Islamic Republic. But we've talked about the need for an ancillary pillar, a supporting prong called maximum support, to actually stand with in practice rather than in principle, protesting Iranians. Just last year, for example, there was a bill introduced in Congress called maximum support. Unfortunately, it didn't go anywhere. There was also amendments, put forward about trying to get a defection strategy going to task the intelligence community to come up with these kind of things. Unfortunately, none of those bills went anywhere, but it's very interesting that had those things become law, the U.S. government would have been in a better position to not get caught flat-footed for when the Iranian government takes out the internet, because there was a lot of stuff in there about secure communications and satellite communications. And then, of course, in terms of if you're trying to flip the script on an unarmed, if you're trying to flip the script in the favor of an unarmed street against a hyper-armed state, you need to go after the security forces. Lest we forget, February 11, 1979, which is the day the Islamic Revolution declared victory, is actually the day that the late Shah's army declared neutrality. So for these political movements to gain power over armed states, they have to find a way to co-opt or nullify or get defections from the armed forces. That is going to be the X factor here in terms of defining, will the protest movement succeed? Can they create enough pressure from the bottom, and can Uncle Sam put enough pressure from the top to get the kind of the people shooting their way through the crisis to defect, to be disloyal, to cause cleavages within the armed forces? Thus far, we have to be realistic. We have not seen that with the political elite, and we have not seen that with respect to the military elite. Potentially, if Donald Trump enters and changes the equation, he could try to tip the balance without getting the U.S. directly involved in the fight between the state and the street. And one thing that comes to mind, which is pretty low cost, there's a kinetic one and a cyber one, it depends how he wants to do it, is to go after the military-grade jamming that is now happening to Starlink satellites that are allowing Iranians to actually be able to send out these videos and send out these pictures to the world. So as we know, since 2019, when there have been major protests in Iran, the regime throttles or shuts down the internet, and under the cover of an information blackout, does mass killing. This is now a trend for them. In this case, there have been over 100+ hours of an internet shutout, so basically 5 days and counting. This is when they've done the bulk of their killing. And if we're going to try to level the playing field, we should be assisting with trying to get more Starlink satellites into Iran. But even then, when the regime is jamming those Starlink satellites with military-grade jamming, perhaps either from a cyber perspective, being able to go after the software that does that jamming, that causes interference with this satellite uplink, or kinetically go after the locations doing the jamming. And in this sense, they could get Iranians back online and be able to get Iranians to continue to organize and communicate with one another, and then share images, videos of their protest movement with the world, and potentially talk about scaling up that support there. So, whoever, quote unquote, flips the switch on the internet again and helps get Iranians back online, that person, that group, that country could go a very long way in Iranian history, because they would have leveled the playing field between the state and the street. There's other options we can talk about as well. I had a piece with the CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Mark Dubowitz, in The Atlantic, where we put forward a menu of options: diplomatic, informational, kinetic, military, economic. There's tons of other things. In the Wall Street Journal, I had a piece with another colleague of ours, Saeed Qaseminejad. He's a trained economic specialist, and we've talked about replicating the oil model with Venezuela. So if you're trying to slow down the regime's repression apparatus, why is it that the regime is able to sell between 1.5 and 2 million barrels of oil a day still to China? This is a big problem. So going after the regime's repression apparatus and pulling the plug on the economic engine that allows the regime to pay the people doing the shooting, that also could go quite a far way.
The headline, the lead story in today's New York Times, Iran says they're set for war, but they're open to talks after the crackdown. How does Iran say to their people and to their military with a straight face that they're ready for war after what happened in the 12-day war, as it's being called, last year, and the ability to for Israel, for the United States to impose their will militarily, essentially through an air campaign against Iran?
So, excellent question, but saying something contradictory and being Orwellian and hyperbolic are not new for the government of the Islamic Republic. It's totally possible to see an array of facts and then intonate something totally different. That is, unfortunately, kind of stylistically and substantively what the leadership of the Islamic Republic has long chosen to do. That's how you get an economy. That's how you get a polity that looks like that kind of a country today. But more importantly, when it comes to the threshold to kind of quote-unquote declare victory, the Islamic Republic, much like its terrorist proxies, always declares victory because it's left standing. So long as it's left standing, it will claim victory and say, aha, my adversaries tried to dislodge me. Aha, my adversaries, they didn't try to defang me. They didn't try to remove the crown jewel of my nuclear apparatus. They didn't try to stop my missiles. They were going after me, and therefore, because I'm alive, ipso facto, I win. So this is the narrative that they have spun over the past 6 months. You'd be hard-pressed to find anybody in Iran who believes it. The challenge is, how do you actually translate this disbelief into cracking or pressing apart on the security forces?
Anthony, Greentown, Pennsylvania, Republican, good morning. You are next.
Good morning, John. Good morning, Mr. Taleblu. Hope everybody's doing well. Good morning, C-SPAN. I have a couple questions and a comment. Actually, comment first. I was wondering, when you mentioned before about the diminishing returns as we go along, I was hoping I'd wake up this morning and find out we did something there last night. And my fear is that the longer we wait to respond to the protests and the crackdown of the protests, that we're going to be less effective in toppling that government. I do believe the government, Iran, the current government, is going to fall, as you mentioned before, inflation and the livelihood of these people isn't very good right now. I have a couple other questions as well.
Can I just address that comment super quick?
Go ahead.
So that which we know / assume the government is doing is, you may have seen something from President Trump on Truth Social the other day about a tariff, but any country that does business with the Islamic Republic and with the U.S. would be subject to a 25% tariff. It'll be interesting to see how that is implemented, because there's still, when we talked about oil again, still room for improvement in terms of President Trump's second-term maximum pressure economic policy. So he's got that tariff out there. And then there was an allegation in the Iranian press yesterday that one of their major news websites, Tasnim News, had to change its domain name. We don't know if this is, lawfare or covert activity or just kind of bureaucratic and legal pressure. But unfortunately, a lot of government and semi-government and semi-official Iranian news agency domains that have a tie into the government do use a .com. So there could have been some legalistic pressure, some bureaucratic pressure to get them to change the domain name. So some of those domains don't, function as of yesterday or today. You can just check them when you go online yourselves that they redirect or they say can't connect. So the tariff and the domain name seem to be things that they've done already, but I grant you that is not enough to change the balance on the streets, nor to put wind beneath the wings of the protesters.
Anthony, give me one more of your questions because we're running short on time.
All right, quickly. I heard a report potentially that the government is using Iraqi people that are in the country now to help crack down, and maybe the armed forces of the country aren't being relied upon for the crackdown. Is that true?
So there is no hard empirical evidence for that, but since 2009, particularly if you talk to protesters and those who've left the country, in major iterations of national anti-regime uprisings, you almost always have some group of Iranians, often in social media, often in real life, saying that in the crackdown they heard kind of commands or orders being given and barked between the paramilitaries doing the repression, kind of knocking back the protesters, as orders or commands not being in the Persian language and orders or commands being in the Arabic language. They're similar, but they're very different languages at the same time, so you can easily tell, what language is kind of being barked, what language is kind of being said. We've heard more and more of those allegations past 2009, and given the fact that I think in 2019, when there was significant flooding in Iran, the Iranian government brought in Afghan Shia militias and Iraqi Shia militias to do flooding, and it was, somewhat...
Flood response?
Flood response.
Okay.
Pardon me, flood response. But it was telling because in the areas that there were previously flooding, there were also protests as well. So one wondered if they were getting people into place to do some kind of a crackdown. But this has always been a long-term fear of both the Iranian dissident community and the protest community, because even if you are successful at co-opting the security forces, the fail-safe of the Islamic Republic seems to be this Shiite Foreign Legion. But we haven't seen hard evidence of that yet, but it's often been something told to us, alleged to us, by previous periods of protest.
Before we run out of time, one more call. Scott's been waiting in the Keystone State as well. Go ahead, Scott. Independent.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. I'd like the host to ask this guy a question after we're done here. Kind of ask him the same question you asked the guest. What would you say to the people of the United States voted Donald Trump in to end these wars, to end this imperialism? But I'd like you the guest to ask you that. And my question would be, all these protesters that supposedly want to go save, but that's just a cover-up. We want to go control this country. But all these protesters that we want to save, usually we see them out there saying death to America. Death to America. All these protesters that we want to go over there and save. But
Scott, I got to cut you off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Scott, I got to cut you off because nothing could be further from the truth. You have a government in that country, in Tehran, who has been chanting death to America, who came to power through street protests in 1978, 1979, through an unholy alliance of leftists and Islamists, and they toppled a U.S.-backed monarchy, and they have taken control of major state resources to actually contest, challenge, and overturn decades of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, forcing America to go deeper and deeper into the Middle East to have to contest and challenge these guys. So not only ideologically is the street not the one saying death to America, the street is the most pro-American, the most pro-Israeli street in the heartland of the Middle East. And it would be a real own goal, strategically, morally, and politically, of epic proportions to miss the gigantic difference that the Iranian people are paying in terms of blood, in terms of their own blood, to help actually stand with us. If you flip the script on the Ayatollahs, you bring back into power the most pro-American population in the Middle East, then we can begin to really talk about how can Uncle Sam peacefully exit the region without getting sucked back in, find a way to actually end some of these really endless conflicts. Because if you remove the arsonist, remember, the Islamic Republic of Iran is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, who's created or co-opted a whole host of these proxy and terror groups in the region that keep sucking us and Israel and some of our other partners in the region back into cycle of violence after cycle of violence. It's not going to be peace and roses and blossoms tomorrow, but you take out the major arsonist behind those, then all of those other conflicts looked imminently much more controllable, containable, and rollbackable.
For much more from Behnam Ben Taleblu, FDD.org is the website of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He's the Senior Director of the Iran program there. We always appreciate your time, especially during a busy time.
Thank you so much.